There are rare moments in history when time seems to fold in on itself. Moments when the distance between what has already happened and what is about to happen feels unsettlingly small. In these moments, ancient words stop sounding symbolic and begin to feel uncomfortably literal. This is one of those moments. For centuries, humanity has looked at the future as something distant, abstract, safely out of reach. But every so often, the future knocks early, and when it does, it often arrives disguised as a warning we chose to ignore. More than 400 years ago, a man wrote lines that were never meant to be read casually. They were not predictions designed to entertain. They were fragments of visions wrapped in riddles, hidden behind metaphor and coded language. That man was Nostradamus. Born in the south of France in the early 1500s, he lived in a world where knowledge itself could be dangerous. To speak too clearly about the future was to invite punishment, exile, or death. The Inquisition was watching. The church was listening. So he learned to hide what he saw, not to deceive, but to survive. In 1555, he published Les Prophéties, a collection of nearly 1,000 short verses known as quatrains. Written in a strange blend of French, Latin, Greek, and Italian, these verses were deliberately obscure. Nostradamus believed that revealing the future too plainly could disrupt the natural order or bring destruction upon himself. Yet despite their cryptic nature, something unsettling has followed his writings across time. Again and again, readers have returned to his words after major historical events and found echoes that feel impossible to dismiss. Fires, wars, revolutions, assassinations, pandemics, moments that reshaped the world, all seemingly reflected in verses written centuries earlier. For most of history, these connections were brushed aside as coincidence, until the coincidences began to pile up. And now, once again, researchers are turning back to his work with a familiar sense of unease, because buried within his final centuries is a passage that seems to point not to a distant age, but to a moment frighteningly close to our own, a moment involving a powerful nation, a winter season, and a sudden disruption of leadership. January, a turning year, and a sense that something long warned about is approaching its surface. This is not a story about fear. It is a story about attention, about recognizing patterns before they fully unfold, and about asking a question humanity has faced before but never comfortably. What if the future has been warning us all along? Before we go deeper, if you feel this subject matters, if you believe understanding the signs is better than ignoring them, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Once the door to the past is opened, it rarely closes quietly. After reading the first verses, the natural reaction is skepticism. It feels safer to believe that ancient prophecies are vague enough to fit any event after the fact. And for a long time, that explanation seemed reasonable, until it didn't. Time after time, humanity has returned to these writings not out of curiosity, but out of shock. Always after something irreversible had already happened, always with the same question trembling beneath the surface. How could he have known? More than a century before it happened, there were verses describing a great fire consuming a powerful city, with references that aligned disturbingly well with London in 1666. Decades before revolution swept France, lines appeared that spoke of the fall of monarchy, of blood filling the streets, of the people rising against their rulers. Before Napoleon ever marched across Europe, there were descriptions of a small man rising to immense power, reshaping nations through war. Even the darkest chapters of the 20th century seemed to cast long shadows backward. The rise of Hitler, identified by a distorted name and placed near the Danube, a global conflict that would engulf nations, cities reduced to ash, millions lost. At the time these verses were written, such destruction would have been unimaginable, and yet the imagery remains hauntingly precise. Skeptics argue that history is being forced to fit poetry. Believers argue the opposite, that poetry was the only language capable of carrying truths too dangerous to state plainly. Somewhere between those two positions lies the real discomfort, the growing list of moments where coincidence begins to feel insufficient. What makes these prophecies especially unsettling is not perfection but pattern. They don't describe every detail. They don't provide dates carved in stone. Instead, they offer outlines, emotional fingerprints of future events. Fear, collapse, fire, silence, shock, power shifting hands. And perhaps most unsettling of all is the delay in recognition. The verses rarely make sense before disaster strikes. They make sense after. That delay creates a cruel rhythm: disbelief, catastrophe, realization, regret. This is why each new interpretation carries weight, not because it promises certainty, but because history shows a recurring habit of ignoring warnings until the cost of ignoring them becomes unbearable. As researchers compare past fulfillments with present conditions, an uncomfortable realization emerges. Many of the same ingredients are visible again: political division, fragile systems, social unrest, global tension, and an overwhelming sense that institutions once thought stable are no longer solid. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes, and when patterns rhyme too closely, the sound becomes impossible to ignore. That realization naturally pulls us forward, away from what has already happened, and toward what may be approaching. Because if these verses echoed real events before, the question is no longer whether they matter. As attention shifts from past fulfillments to future possibilities, one particular verse begins to stand apart. Not because it is clearer than the others, but because its symbols feel uncomfortably familiar. This is where interpretation stops being abstract and starts feeling personal. Hidden within the final century of Nostradamus's work is a quatrain that speaks of a powerful nation, born from revolution, marked by pride and authority. A land symbolized by an eagle. For centuries, that image could have applied to empires long gone. But in the modern world, the association becomes almost unavoidable. The eagle is not just an animal, it is a statement: power, vigilance, dominance from above. No nation has embraced that symbol more completely than the United States. It appears on its seal, its currency, its military insignia. It represents the republic itself, strength paired with freedom. The verse continues by anchoring the event in a season, a time when the year turns cold, winter. A moment of pause, transition, and vulnerability. In the Northern Hemisphere, winter is when systems are tested, when energy grids strain, when travel slows, when tensions rise behind closed doors. And within winter, there is one month that carries unique political weight: January. January is not just the beginning of a calendar year in America. It is the month of oaths, of ceremonies, of leadership transitions. It is when power is reaffirmed, or quietly reshaped. It is also when the eyes of the world focus on a single city, a single stage. Then comes the most unsettling phrase: the voice of the people silenced by thunder. Thunder, in this context, feels wrong. Thunder does not belong to winter. It is sudden, violent, overwhelming. It drowns out all other sound. In symbolic language, thunder has always represented shock. Explosions, violence, upheaval, events so loud they leave no room for dialogue. And when thunder appears, the verse tells us, the throne shakes and the crown falls. America has no throne, no crown, no king. But it does have a seat of power unlike any other on earth. A presidency whose decisions ripple across continents. A leadership position so influential that any disruption sends immediate shockwaves through global markets, alliances, and conflicts. This is where interpretation grows darker. The imagery suggests not just instability, but interruption. A break in continuity. A moment when authority itself falters, even briefly. History shows how fragile such moments can be. One act, one failure, one unexpected event, and the balance shifts. The final line deepens the unease. From the east, a shadow moves across the land. In ancient texts, the east often symbolized external forces, rising powers, unseen movements beyond the horizon. In modern terms, it invites geopolitical interpretation: rival nations, strategic adversaries, opportunists waiting for weakness. Taken together, the verse does not describe a single detail, It describes a condition, a moment when internal disruption meets external pressure, when noise overwhelms reason, when leadership wavers, and when consequences extend far beyond one nation's borders. This realization naturally pushes the question forward, not if timing matters, but why this moment in particular. Once the symbolism of the verse is understood, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why this time? Why does January carry such weight in this interpretation? Why does the sense of disruption feel anchored not only in imagery, but in timing? January is not a neutral month in American life. It is a moment of reset, but also of exposure. Every 4 years, it marks the formal transfer or reaffirmation of power. Ceremonies take place. Oaths are sworn. The world watches closely. Beneath the pageantry, however, lies a fragile reality. Transitions are moments when systems are most vulnerable. History shows that instability rarely announces itself loudly at first. It emerges during pauses, handovers, and moments of symbolic closure. January is exactly that, a threshold between what was and what will be. And thresholds in both myth and history are where disruptions tend to occur. Those who study Nostradamus' work often emphasize that he was not only a visionary, but a careful observer of cycles. He believed history moved in patterns, not straight lines. Empires rose, stabilized, decayed, and eventually transformed. When one cycle ended, another began, often through crisis. This idea is reinforced through numerological interpretations associated with the quatrain. While controversial, these readings focus less on prediction and more on symbolism. Numbers are treated as markers of transition rather than exact dates. Endings disguised as beginnings, stability giving way to transformation. In political terms, 2026 sits at an uncomfortable crossroads. It is a midpoint year, a moment when long-term decisions made earlier begin to show consequences. Economic pressure, institutional fatigue, and social division tend to surface most clearly when momentum slows. The future has not fully arrived, but the past can no longer hold. Astrology adds another layer to this interpretation. Nostradamus paid close attention to celestial movements, believing planetary alignments reflected human behavior and collective tension. In January 2026, several astrologers note a rare convergence involving Mars and Saturn, symbols traditionally associated with conflict, restriction, consequence, and reckoning. Mars represents action, aggression, and force. Saturn represents limits, authority, and accountability. When these two energies collide, ancient traditions described periods of confrontation between impulse and structure, between pressure and restraint. Not necessarily chaos, but strain. Systems being tested to their limits. The fact that this alignment occurs during a period already charged with political and social tension only amplifies its symbolic impact. It suggests a moment when suppressed pressures rise to the surface, when decisions can no longer be postponed, when avoidance becomes impossible. Importantly, none of this implies inevitability. Cycles do not dictate outcomes, they describe conditions. They show when change becomes more likely, not what form it must take. A storm does not decide which tree will fall. It only reveals which ones are weak. This is where the interpretation shifts from prediction to responsibility. If January 2026 represents a pressure point, then awareness becomes power. Understanding timing allows preparation. It allows choice. And that leads naturally to the most unsettling possibility of all, that what lies ahead may not be a single event, but something far more complex. Once timing enters the picture, the nature of the event itself becomes the next unavoidable question. If January 2026 represents a pressure point, what exactly breaks under that pressure? And more importantly, does it break once, or does it keep breaking? Some researchers believe the prophecy points to a single dramatic incident. A moment so shocking it silences everything else. An assassination. A sudden collapse of leadership. A violent act that freezes the nation in disbelief. History has already shown that no country, no matter how powerful, is immune to such moments. One bullet, one explosion, one decision made in seconds can alter decades of stability. Others argue that the thunder described is not political at all, but geological or environmental. A massive storm, an earthquake, a rupture along a long dormant fault line. Nature has a way of humbling even the most advanced civilizations. And when disaster strikes suddenly, systems reveal their weaknesses with brutal honesty. There is also the growing concern of something less visible, but equally devastating. A man-made disruption that doesn't arrive with fire or noise, but with silence. A cyber attack that cripples power grids. A collapse of digital infrastructure. An economic shock that spreads faster than any army ever could. In a world built on networks, the most effective attacks are often the ones we don't hear coming. Yet among all these possibilities, one interpretation stands out as the most disturbing. Not because it is dramatic, but because it feels familiar. What if January 2026 is not about a single event at all? What if it marks the beginning of a cascade? History rarely collapses in one clean moment. More often it unravels through sequences. One failure weakens another. One shock amplifies the next. Confidence erodes. Trust breaks down. And systems that once seemed resilient begin to fold under cumulative stress. The economy, already strained, does not need a total collapse, only a strong enough push. Banks tighten, markets panic, jobs disappear. Fear spreads faster than facts. Political divisions, already deep, turn sharper. Protests grow louder. Authority responds with force. Each reaction feeds the next. Globally, the consequences multiply. Allies hesitate. Rivals advance. Long-standing agreements fracture. What once felt unthinkable suddenly becomes discussable, then possible, then real. This is how empires do not fall, not in a day but in stages. The prophecy, in this reading, does not describe a single disaster. It describes momentum, a shift from balance to imbalance, from stability to uncertainty. What makes this interpretation so unsettling is how closely it mirrors present conditions. Fragile economies, polarized societies, distrust in institutions, global tension simmering just below the surface. None of these elements alone guarantees collapse. Together they form a system under strain. And systems under strain do not need fate to intervene. They only need pressure, which brings the narrative to its most important turning point. Because if this is a cascade, then it is not only something that happens, it is something that unfolds. And what unfolds can still be influenced. At the end of every prophecy lies the same uncomfortable question. Is the future fixed, or is it listening to us? This is where interpretations often divide. Some believe what was foreseen must unfold exactly as written, that humanity is simply moving along a path already carved by fate. Others believe prophecy exists for a different reason, not to imprison us but to wake us up. There is evidence of both views within the ancient texts. Some verses suggest inevitability, a sense that cycles repeat regardless of human resistance. But others carry a quieter implication, that awareness itself changes outcomes, that the act of seeing what lies ahead alters how people respond when they arrive there. If January 2026 represents a moment of crisis, then the most important question is not what will happen, but how people will meet it. Crisis does not automatically mean destruction. Throughout history, moments of extreme pressure have also produced reform, renewal, and unexpected unity. Collapse and transformation often stand side by side. The difference lies in response. What makes this moment feel different is not the prophecy alone, but the context surrounding it. The world already feels strained. Trust in institutions has weakened. Social bonds feel thinner. The pace of change has outgrown our ability to emotionally process it. In such conditions, even a moderate shock can feel overwhelming or clarifying. This is where the idea of prophecy as a mirror becomes powerful. A mirror does not force action. It simply reflects what is already there. If the reflection is fractured, the mirror is not to blame. But it can still serve a purpose, showing what needs attention before it breaks completely. Preparation, in this sense, is not about fear. It is about grounding, staying informed without becoming consumed, staying connected rather than retreating into isolation, strengthening communities, relationships, and systems at a human level. Because when large structures fail, it is always people who catch one another first. There is also an invitation hidden beneath the warning, an invitation to move beyond passive spectatorship, to stop treating history as something that happens to us, and start recognizing our role in shaping what comes next. Every choice, political, social, personal, ripples outward. Futures are built quietly, long before they arrive loudly. If January 2026 is a crossroads, then it is not destiny standing there waiting. It is possibility. The ancient texts speak of darkness, yes, but they also speak of renewal, of old systems giving way to something more honest, more resilient, more aligned with human dignity. Birth is never clean. Transformation is never comfortable. But stagnation is far more dangerous than change. Perhaps that is the real message behind the prophecy. Not fear, not doom, but responsibility. The future is not written in stone. It is written in decisions. And if a warning echoes across centuries only to reach us now, then maybe it arrived not because we are powerless, but because we are still capable of choosing differently.